Hey guys, Kelly with St. Johns County Parks and Recreation. And this week I wanted to take a moment to talk to you about Florida's threatened and endangered species. So on May 18th was actually Endangered Species Day, so this is pretty good timing to bring you some information about how species get listed, what it means to be listed, and to highlight some of our endangered wildlife here in the state of Florida. First and foremost, for those of you who don't know me, I work for St. Johns County. St. Johns County has 42 miles of beach. We have intercoastal waterways and we border the St. Johns River. We have a wide variety of species, and almost all of the ones that I will specifically cover today you can find somewhere here in the county. There's a couple that are in neighboring counties or in other parts of Florida. I specifically work for our Parks and Recreation department. Our Parks and Rec department is a diverse department that handles everything from ball fields to playgrounds to beach access. I specifically have the best job in the department. I work as a parks naturalist for our department. I do under non-pandemic situations, kayak trips, and lots of in-person programming. So this is a great opportunity for me to still be able to connect with you all and bring you some good info while I can't be with you in person. Hopefully soon that changes. So let's start with the basic classifications for an animal species. So right now there are three really main buckets that they can be put into. They can be considered federally endangered, which means they are at risk of going extinct. They could be federally threatened, which means they are at risk of becoming endangered, or they can be state threatened. So this is a listing of species that is specifically done by our state government, by our Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. Our federally threatened species are handled through U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Now there are some species like the one pictured here. Maybe some of you know what this rare / elusive / most likely extinct bird is. This is the ivory-billed woodpecker. So this is an animal species that would be considered federally endangered. However, it has not been confirmed in the wild since the early 1900s. So about 1944 was the last confirmed sighting of this. Now there were some unconfirmed sightings in the early 2000s, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody really saw one. For those of you who don't know, there was actually a federally listed species of seal as well here in the state of Florida. So it was federally endangered for a long time, and fairly recently it was determined to be extinct. So that was a Caribbean monk seal. So we had seals here in Florida, which was really cool. That'd be neat if we still had that, but we can't go back in time. So we'll focus today on the species that we still have a chance to save. So by the numbers, we have 53 federally endangered species here in the state of Florida. We have 40 federally threatened species in the state of Florida, and then we have 39 state threatened species, and these numbers are from an annual report put out by FWC from 2018. So how do things get listed? There's two different ways, but I want to note so that as we go through this presentation, you understand some of the dates on the slides. So in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed, and that kind of formally launched most of the national protection that we see today on our federally endangered and threatened species. However, prior to 1973, there were a series of other acts that allowed species to be established, but there wasn't necessarily this listing process, and there wasn't necessarily any protections given to those species or their habitat. So the Endangered Species Act of 1973 kind of formalized everything and is the official document that has been continued to be updated, but that is really still utilized as the framework today for our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service managing these endangered species. So in order to get something listed today through the current Endangered Species Act, there are really two processes. The first process is a self-initiated project, meaning the agency feels that there's a potential that this specific species may need to be listed. So they will go through a self-initiated process where they go through a peer review, and they will reevaluate after the peer review and determine if it's warranted or not to continue in the process. After that, if they continue to say, no, it probably really does need to be listed, then they'll put together guidelines and rules that would go around this species. They'll then get public comment, and in that public comment period, based on the outcome, the rules can either be withdrawn or modified, or final rulings will be published on the status of that species. So that's the first way. That's not as common, not typically how that process goes. What is more common, and the process that is more likely to be seen for a species to be either listed, delisted, meaning they're taken off the listing or some sort of modification to their listing, is through petitions. So a lot of times, nonprofit organizations, government organizations, usually it's some sort of group of people, it's very rarely an individual, but it could be, will send in a petition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They will have a 90-day review process, and after they review that process, they will either say, this petition has merit, and we would like to move forward with pursuing that petition, whatever it may be, or we don't really feel like this has merit or meets the standards that we need to make changes, and so they'll issue a negative finding at the end of those 90 days. And you can actually go and see what petitions are currently open. I went down that rabbit hole and spent like an hour looking at all of the petitions to either delist or list new species, and it's really interesting to see what perspectives people are utilizing to kind of justify their cases to the federal government. So if they're positive after 90 days saying, hey, we might need some regulation and some listing status here, it then is opened up for public comment. After public comment, it goes through a more rigorous fine-tooth status review process. And then after that process, it kind of goes on down the list. And then at the very end, there's another chance for public comment where either everything can be withdrawn or a final rule is published. So that can be a very long, lengthy process. And even then, usually if it looks like it warrants, it becomes a candidate, and then it still has to be selected to be on the endangered species list. So it's a long, big process, as to be expected with a large government organization. And things work a little bit differently on the state level. So on the state level, from about 1972, which was when the Endangered Species Act passed, which required state organizations to kind of come up with a system, to about 1999, there was really no specific guidelines that were being used. It was pretty flawed, fairly political in what was listed and what wasn't listed. In 2000, a lot of changes were made, still not necessarily the right process in place. And so in 2010, they came up with a plan that really has become fairly robust today, which is called the Imperiled Species Management Program. And this program allowed for anything that was previously listed as a state species to only be listed as state threatened, because they had three categories before. They had state, federal, or state endangered, state threatened, and then species of special concern. And they were like, no, this is too much. This is too confusing. We're going to simplify it. It's going to be one ranking of state threatened species. And so what they did is they went through this long, lengthy process of evaluating all of the species that were currently on that list, or any of those lists, to see, did they still warrant listing? What kind of management plan needed to be in place to ensure basically they'd be taken off the list? What kinds of things do we need to do to protect that species? And then what needed to be delisted? So what was something that made it on the list that today's science just didn't warrant the protections that it needed? And they compiled all of this into a huge plan in 2016 called the Imperiled Species Management Plan. That's a 10-year plan, basically to make sure that we preserve those species that we want to save and potentially delist them. Anything that was previously listed that is no longer listed, there are still some management kind of protections and guidelines in place, because we also don't want them to end up back on the list. And they'll continue to reevaluate that process. So in the meantime, Moving forward, beyond the species that had been previously listed, there's a new process in place in order to determine if a species needs a state designation as threatened. And so that process looks something like what's on your screen here. So it goes through a species evaluation request, and that request can be made by anybody to say, hey, I need you to look at, I would like you to look into this further. I think there's some warrant here for listing of the species and protection of the species. That species then goes through a biological status review, which is made up of scientists and findings about whether or not it needs a species action plan. And so basically, as things are approved or given the okay down the list, the process moves forward. If at any point you feel like they don't have sufficient evidence or the evidence provided doesn't warrant listing, then the process stops. So once it goes under biological review, they look at species action plans and what kind of plan needs to be in place to save this species. They then come up with draft rules and regulations, which have to be approved by the commission, and then that species would join the imperiled species list for the state. Now, in the state of Florida, species that are either federally threatened, federally endangered, or state threatened are broken down into different categories based on the type of animal. So in the state of Florida, we have 4 amphibians that are a listed species, 15 fish, 25 reptiles, 31 birds, 33 mammals, and 35 invertebrates. Our invertebrates include a wide variety of categories, including but not limited to insects and coral. So that's neat. For the purposes of today's presentation and your time and my time, so I don't go down rabbit holes, I only want to focus on reptiles, birds, and mammals, and I'm going to handpick just a couple from each category to highlight because either they have a unique story or they're found here locally. So I'm going to start with reptiles. I'm going to give you an example of a federally endangered reptile, a federally threatened reptile, and a state threatened reptile. So here in the state of Florida, we have actually leatherback nests, and we have a couple on our St. Johns County beaches right now, which is super exciting. So the leatherback sea turtle in 1970 was federally listed as an endangered species. So once again, there was a listing process prior to the Endangered Species Act. It was covered under different legislation. Once that Endangered Species Act was enacted, all of these species rolled into that act. These guys are found throughout the state of Florida. They're actually found in much larger range than pretty much any other sea turtle species because of their large size. So they can be 1,200 to over 2,000 pounds. They're huge, huge sea turtles. And these animals can handle the colder weather. So they have a much larger range where most other sea turtles are usually just on either side of the equator. And it's important to note that while I'm highlighting the leatherback sea turtle because it's a personal favorite of mine, all sea turtle species found in the state of Florida. So there are 5 that are found in our waters and 4 that nest on our beaches. So all 5 found in our waters, which are your hawksbill sea turtle, your green sea turtle, your loggerhead sea turtle, your Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, and your green sea turtle are all found on either an endangered or threatened species listing at the federal level. Their biggest threats include, but are not at all limited to, entanglement, habitat loss, and poaching. So something to really keep in mind, while we have strict regulations here through our Endangered Species Act for a lot of these species, like the sea turtle, they do not stay in our waters. They do not stay and only nest here on our beaches. And so in other areas where these animals are found internationally, they don't necessarily have the same protections that they have here. And so poaching of sea turtles themselves for meat or for the eggs is very common practice in lots of areas, other areas of the world. And so while we can do our best here and try to put forth the best practices for the species that are utilizing our beaches and our waters, that's not a foolproof plan to save a species, as it will take international efforts to save most of these species if we want their range to remain intact. The next one is a really unique story, which is why I put it in here. There's really very few other instances like this. So the American alligator today is federally listed, and they're an endangered species success story. So in 1967, they were federally listed as an endangered species. However, in 1987, they were pronounced as fully recovered. So in that 20-year span, not only did the Endangered Species Act pass, but there was other legislation as well that had to deal with the transport of alligator meat and hide over state lines, the increase of alligator farming, and really that whole process of poaching alligators greatly decreased as a result of this combination of legislation. That decrease in illegal hunting of alligators allowed for their species to recover. If you live in Florida now, you know that we have alligators in pretty much every body of freshwater. There's an estimated like 1.5 to 2 million alligators in the state of Florida, and that's out of an entire population in the southeastern United States of about 5 million alligators. But even though this species is fully recovered, they actually remain on the endangered species list for federally threatened species because it looks similar to the American crocodile. So it is actually threatened due to it looking like something else that is actually threatened. And so our American crocodile species is found in South Florida and the Everglades, Biscayne Bay area. And our American crocodile species is a federally listed species that their numbers are declining. They are in jeopardy of potentially going extinct if we can't save their populations. And so they have to be preserved because we don't want people out there thinking that they're, safely hunting or going after an alligator and they're actually going after an American crocodile. So today, even to this day, even though we have a lot of alligators, there are additional protections placed on them. We have regulated hunts. You have to have certain paperwork in order to have certain alligator products or to do any kind of necessarily alligator farming. And so there's just some extra protections even though they are fully recovered. Now, that doesn't mean that their population couldn't plummet again. And so we also want to make sure that not only are we conserving the American alligator for the sake of the American crocodile, but for the sake of their population. And so their threats are going to be illegal hunting and habitat loss. We do have legal hunts here at this time. Our population levels are more than high enough to sustain hunts. But we don't want illegal hunting outside of those hunting quotas that have been determined by state scientists of what's safe and what that population can handle to be hunted. Okay, this is my favorite. So you had to know if you follow me and Augie that this is going to be on the presentation today. Gopher tortoises are the cutest, most adorable species that exist. And in 1976, they were listed as a state species of special concern. So remember when I talked about that, the listing process was sort of wishy-washy and not clearly defined until really about 2010. This was listed before then. However, when it went through the process to kind of in the early 2000s to come up with this new imperiled species management plan, it went through the process and they did again determine that it should be reclassified as a state threatened species. And to this day, it still has state protections. These guys are incredibly important, and we want to make sure we maintain them, not just for the sake of their population, but for the sake of a lot of other populations that rely on gopher tortoises. So gopher tortoises dig burrows underground, and these burrows have been documented to house over 350 other types of species. So we're thinking things like bunnies and snakes and frogs and insects and lizards. All of these things utilize gopher tortoise burrows. So if you remove gopher tortoises and subsequently the burrows that they dig, these ecosystems could collapse. So we want to make sure we preserve gopher tortoises. That's why there's lots of additional protections placed on them because of their threatened status, but also because of the important role that they play. So you do have to have permits to pretty much do anything with a gopher tortoise. And one of the biggest threats to gopher tortoise is habitat loss. So they like to live in areas that are high and dry, well-drained soil, but that's also typically where we like to put developments. So whenever we do have developments now, you do have to have surveys of gopher tortoises, and you do have to go through the process to relocate them to an approved relocation site, because we don't want to lose these animals. It is note that it is illegal to entomb them. That was a practice that was done many years ago that is no longer allowed. So you cannot just come through and bulldoze and basically bury them alive. You do have to relocate them through the state permitting process. Note that the gopher tortoise is not just found in Florida. It is found throughout the southeastern United States. And in a portion of its range in Alabama and Mississippi, the gopher tortoise is actually federally listed as threatened. And the rest of its range is a candidate for protection on a federal level as well, but has not been approved to be added to the federal listing. Birds! I hope that you guys know what this charismatic bird is here. If you don't, we'll go over it in a couple of slides. This is one of my favorite birds to encounter in the wild, mainly because I'm not much of a birder, but this one's super distinctive and very curious, so it's usually very easy to see. So the first one I want to talk about is the red-cockaded woodpecker. And while the maps don't show any red-cockaded woodpeckers here in St. Johns County, they're in surrounding counties, and there's huge conservation efforts, especially over in like Putnam County area and closer to the Ocala National Forest. So in 1970, it received its designation as an endangered species on the federal level. And in 2006, FWC implemented the red-cockaded woodpecker safe harbor program. And this program is a unique program that's done with lots of other states. But basically, this program allows for private property owners to go through the process to restore habitat that the red-cockaded woodpecker would use. And in the process of restoring that habitat, if they end up with more red-cockaded woodpeckers on their property, they don't necessarily get additional restrictions because of those red-cockaded woodpeckers being on their property. So it's an incentive to restore the habitat without necessarily some of the restrictions that come with attracting a species like this to your property. To date, FWC reports that this program conserves about 15,000 acres of land for the red-cockaded woodpecker. Or I'm sorry, not 15, 65,000 acres of land are in this program, and 15 landowners are contributing to it. And these are private property owners. There are lots and lots of public lands that do have red-cockaded woodpeckers, but this safe harbor program was really geared toward private property owners to allow for them to do restoration work and enhance their property without incurring any additional hindrances or restrictions as a result of these species coming into their property. Throughout the United States, these programs, like the one FWC has, are in other states. And total, the safe harbor programs to date have conserved or help enhance habitat for the red-cockaded woodpecker in about 620,000 acres of land. So that's really cool. Breeding population estimates put the red-cockaded woodpecker at about 15,000 breeding individuals. And it's important to note that this bird is also protected by the U.S. Migratory Bird and Treaty Act, which gives a whole another set of protections to this species. Now, something to note is their biggest threat by far is habitat loss, and it's specifically habitat loss of old growth pine trees. So the red-cockaded woodpecker would be found in longleaf pine ecosystems, which that ecosystem has been completely decimated in the southeastern United States. There is a very minimal percentage left of the original footprint of a longleaf pine ecosystem. And while there are a lot of restoration efforts coming online in more recent years to add longleaf ecosystems to our network of conservation land, it takes a long time for them to grow and a long time for them to mature. And these red-cockaded woodpeckers specifically want matured trees that they will have cavities in, that they will nest in. As a result, there's huge efforts underway to basically create nest boxes and nesting habitat for the red-cockaded woodpecker that is basically man-made. So we can't create a 100-year-old tree. That's not possible. You need 100 years to create a 100-year-old tree. And so what we have to do is basically mimic the conditions of a 100-year-old tree and the size of the opening and the size of the cavity and start the cavity for the red-cockaded woodpecker. And that's a huge conservation effort for this species. If you've ever seen one of these, super cool. If you haven't, probably not going to find it here in St. Johns County, but head towards the Ocala National Forest. Pretty neat stuff. The next one is the one that was on the slide a couple slides ago. This is a Florida scrub jay. This is one of the most curious birds that I have ever seen in the wild. These guys in 1987 became threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And there is a huge citizen science initiative and group around this species. And so in 2002, they started this program called Jaywatch. And there were a couple organizations who were originally involved in Jaywatch. And their original plan was basically to go out and monitor to figure out how many birds they had. And there's a separate banding program as well. So you can see that if you look on the legs of this bird, it has bands, so you can start to identify individuals. And Jaywatch in 2002 started with 11 sites. In 2012, Jaywatch was became coordinated by the Florida Audubon Society. And so that group then worked with FWC and private landowners and public landowners, and they basically organized all the organizations to start an effort for a uniform monitoring program for the Florida scrub jay. And so according to their last report, their 2019 report, they are now up to 45 sites that they are monitoring annually for the Florida scrub jay. It is believed that our breeding population here in Florida is about 4,000 individuals. And what's really cool about this species, and one of the reasons we really want to make sure that we protect it, is that this is an endemic species to Florida, meaning you can only find this species here in the state of Florida. And the reason we ended up with the Florida scrub jay actually relates to our geological history. So if you go back in time, there was a point in time where Florida's sea level was about 150 feet above what we currently have today. And all that was left of Florida was a chain of islands. These chain of islands is known today as the Lake Wales Ridge. And in that Lake Wales Ridge was a jay. And that jay, being isolated from the continental United States, evolved into the Florida scrub jay. So this is a distinctive blue jay species that is only found here in the Florida scrub habitat, utilizing also endemic Florida scrub plants in their habitat. So one of their biggest threats is habitat fragmentation, getting enough connected habitat to support healthy populations. Ecosystem integrity, so these birds like to be in the high and dry scrub habitats, and these habitats require regular fire, so they're on a fire rotation and schedule. And if that fire does not come through that scrub ecosystem will become very overgrown and not suitable habitat for the scrub jay. So it's important that not only the land itself is conserved, but the integrity of that land is conserved as well. In addition, as with most species in such a state where we live, where populations are just totally blooming, habitat loss, because that scrub habitat, just like our gopher tortoise habitat, wants to be high and dry. And so we have seen a decrease in scrub habitat throughout time in the state of Florida. But there's been huge efforts to conserve the Florida scrub jay, and the numbers are on the rise, especially compared to when they were originally listed in 1987. If you look today, this is a picture from Florida Audubon's last report of 2019 for Jaywatch. This is a great map kind of showing you where in Florida we really have scrub jays and where they are no longer found. So you will notice that here in St. Johns County, the Florida scrub jay population has been extirpated. However, if you head west a little, you'll notice that the Ocala National Forest, which is right there and kind of in the middle in the light blue, is full of scrub jays, and surrounding areas as well have scrub jays. That gives you a good idea of the distribution of where they are currently found, and potentially if we can restore habitat and create connectivity, where they could potentially be found in the future if conservation efforts are successful. The next species is here right now nesting. This is the least tern, and it was listed in 1985 under the Endangered Species Act. However, just like a gopher tortoise, that only covers part of its range. So in 1985, the least tern was only protected in the Midwest and the Great Plains. So that does not include here in Florida. So here in Florida, they are not considered federally endangered. But they are on that state threatened species. So they are a species that our state, Florida Fish and Wildlife, has listed as a state threatened species. And they also are protected by the Migratory Bird Act. So there is a huge citizens effort with this bird as well. So you have Jay Watch with the scrub jays, and with this bird as well as a couple of other shorebirds that we have here that are on the state threatened list. There is a Florida Shorebird Alliance that launched in 2009, and this Shorebird Alliance is great at basically organizing all of our local and state agencies in order to monitor nesting behavior of our shorebirds. So they will go and do nest counts and fledgling counts and egg counts. In addition, they will monitor areas, they will rope them off, and what I think is a really important part of their job is they have bird stewards who will actually educate the public, because a lot of times these birds are nesting at our beaches where we want to go and hang out at the beach. And here in St. Johns County, we actually have two really large least tern colonies on our beaches. One is found at Anastasia State Park, and one is found at Fort Matanzas at the southern end of Anastasia Island. And they're both really popular places for people to recreate. And so we want to make sure that we're educating people about these least terns, because two of their biggest threats are habitat loss and human disturbance. So these guys like to have basically minimal vegetation beach area that is high and dry. So they don't want to be in the area where the water's going to come up and wash over their nests and their eggs. That's also where we like to be. That's also sometimes where we put houses where we're experiencing erosion, and they actually also nest on gravel rooftops. And there are very few gravel rooftops left, and most gravel rooftops that are left have been slowly replaced over the last few years, so they lose those nesting sites as well. Human disturbance is huge. Like we talked about, there's a huge interface of these birds and humans kind of colliding at our beach systems. So they are roped off, and we want to make sure that we don't go into their habitat, because their eggs are camouflage colors, look just like the sand. You would have to have a really good eye to see those eggs in the sand, because all that mom's doing is scooping out a little bit of sand and putting down a teeny tiny egg that looks just like the sand. So you wouldn't want to accidentally step on an egg or a chick, which also looks just like the sand. And in addition, if you get close, you'll know, because those birds will be so mad that you're there. They will start squawking and swarming and coming overhead to try to protect their young. But when they flush from the nest like that, meaning they kind of all come up off of their eggs at once, their eggs are left exposed. And through that exposure, they can actually cook, because it's Florida and it's super hot. And so if they don't have mom or dad on the nest in order to cool them down, that can cause trouble. It also opens them up to predation. So our least terns, they're here right now. They come here every summer to nest, and then they go back to South America. And they nest throughout most of the United States. But they are state threatened here in Florida. And like I said, they are federally endangered only in the Midwest and the Great Plains. Mammals. So mammals, I did a little bit differently because there was almost too much I wanted to tell you. So I have a couple bonus. We've got a couple federally endangered, state threatened, and federally threatened species that I want to share with you. So first is probably the poster child for Florida's endangered species. That's the Florida panther. So the Florida panther in 1967 was federally listed as an endangered species. In 1995, they actually embarked on genetic restoration efforts So I'll show you this map here. You can see that Florida panther numbers were in huge decline, less than 60 individuals left in the wild, and the genetics were getting very bottlenecked, meaning there wasn't a lot of diversity. And as a result, there were becoming a lot of genetic issues, like crooked tail, issues with male sperm, and they were having a lot of problems with the genetic diversity in the population. So as a result, they took 8 Texas pumas and they introduced them to the population in the Everglades. Those Texas pumas, as you can see through this graph here, introduced a whole new set of genetics to the population and kind of stabilized their genetics, and it gave them enough diversity that they weren't seeing those genetic defects that they had previously been seeing. In 2008, a recovery plan was implemented, and in 2013, the Florida Panther Recovery Implementation Team was created. So there's lots of agencies who are involved in the Florida Panther recovery process. It's not just U.S. Fish and Wildlife, because that's where they're listed under. It's U.S. Fish and Wildlife, it's the National Park Service, it's Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. There's other nonprofit groups that are part of that organization. And so that team was implemented in 2013, basically to implement the plan that was created in 2008. What they kind of figured out was there was a lot of different people doing a lot of different things, and that they could do a lot more together if they were really more organized. So in 2013, they kind of solidified their organizational group and are really working towards panther research and panther conservation. It's important to note that the reason they were able to bring in the Texas pumas is because that historically this species would have covered most of the southeastern United States. So this is the same thing as a Texas puma, same thing as a mountain lion. It's just a subspecies of those species. And so Florida got very isolated due to deforestation and development and a lot of factors, hunting, and they've started to evolve a subspecies, but they used to all be connected. And so they were able to take those panthers from Texas and introduce them into Florida because they're still the same species, so they're still able to breed with each other. And that's something that was missing in our Florida populations because it didn't have the chance to interact with any other population in order to get that genetic diversity. But one of the biggest threats that face panthers today are habitat loss. So they have a huge home range. Each panther has tens of miles, that is their square miles, that is their home range. Males have a huge home range, females have a smaller home range. Roads are one of the most deadly things for panthers. Most collared panthers that we have information for, or reports of panthers that are on the side of the road, have been hit by cars. So in South Florida along Alligator Alley there and some other areas of Collier County are really popular areas where unfortunately panthers are getting struck by cars. And then the decreased genetic diversity is still a threat. So that genetic diversity greatly increased since the introduction of the Texas pumas in 1995. But there's still a small population, maybe 150 to 200 individuals at most. So there's still some genetic bottlenecking there, and there have been talks in the past, who knows if it will ever happen, of reintroducing new Texas pumas to kind of increase the genetic diversity and give it another jump start. I do want to watch a video about how they collar panthers. So one of the most successful ways that they gather data on the Florida panther population regarding where they're going and what they're doing and how many babies they're having is through this collaring process. So they try to collar every individual panther, adult panther that they can. So that they can really keep tabs on what's happening with this population. I know through this collaring process and through game cams, they found last year some of the first indications that panthers were able to cross the Caloosahatchee River, which is down in the Fort Myers area of Florida, and start to expand that northern range. There have been panthers, and by panthers, I really mean panther. There's been one recorded panther kind of up here near the Florida-Georgia line and a couple closer to the Ocala National Forest. There is by no means an established population here, and these are individuals that just seem to have gotten lost. So we really don't have panthers here in St. Johns County or really Northeast Florida. The ones that have ended up here are kind of a fluke, and they don't really know how they ended up here. So more or less, generally speaking, panthers are going to be in that Southwest Florida region in our larger conservation lands. So once again, I want to show you this video about the panther and the collaring process that they go through in order to track these species.
Looking for tracks in the dirt at sunrise is only the beginning of the process to collar a Florida panther. Using ATVs or buggies, dogs with tracking devices, shortwave radio communication, and determination, the panther team divides and sets out in conditions ranging from a wee bit chilly to mostly scorching with a 100% chance of insects. Sometimes this process can take a few days, but if it's a lucky day, the dogs will find and tree an uncollared panther. The team gathers nearby as the tranquilizer gun is prepared and the veterinarian loads the dart. Radio communication is maintained with the houndsman as the panther is darted.
Now that the dart is in the panther and it's been a couple minutes, the drugs have started to take effect. We bring the crash bag in. We also have a large cargo net that we stretch out over top of that crash bag, assuming it falls out of the tree. The other thing that can happen is the panther will fall asleep in the tree and actually be stuck up there. That's the point where the tree climber, which is myself, I'll put the climbing spikes on and the safety harness, and I'll climb up the tree.
With a panther's eye view of the waiting net, Mark has to decide whether to tie a rope and lower the cat down, or the FWC veterinarian and biologist quickly assess the panther, attaching a collar, inserting a transponder, and tattoo each ear for identification purposes. While the animal is sleeping, they are given IV fluids, vaccinated against a host of diseases, and given an overall health check. When the workup and cleanup is complete, most of the panther team dissolve back into the wild, leaving the panther to wake as the vet watches from a distance, making sure the animal wakes normally. Occasionally, a panther has a need for rehabilitation due to a vehicle collision or other injury. In these cases, the FWC releases them back into the home range from where they came. Once a panther is collared, they're tracked 3 times a week from a fixed-wing airplane, and the information is saved in a database used to plot home ranges and location. If a female panther is found in one area for at least 3 flights, it's an indication that she is denning, hopefully producing a litter of kittens. Biologists then triangulate her position on the ground and set up a remote monitoring station. It's dubbed Biologist in a Box, a device that includes a telemetry receiver, cell phone, and antennas, which helps tell the biologist if the mother panther is in residence. Once the kittens are located, sex is determined. They're weighed, dewormed, and photographed. A tissue sample is taken from the ear for genetic analysis, and a transponder chip is inserted for identification. It's the same type commonly used for house pets. By the way, there's no evidence that a panther mother will reject her kittens due to the touch of human hands. Intense conservation efforts working with public and private partners have reversed the downward spiral toward extinction of this critically endangered species. We must continue to conserve and protect this symbol of Florida's strength and resilience. That means funding critical services. If you want to help do something good, put your money where your heart is and buy a panther plate. Don't let this little one be one of the last ones.
So Florida panthers are iconic to our state, and we want to make sure we don't lose them. And so this is one project that Florida Fish and Wildlife partners with a lot of other agencies to work on to make sure that we conserve our panther species. And panther species, according to that 2008 recovery plan, will not be considered for delisting, so removal from the endangered status, until there are 3 distinct populations of Florida panthers that all reach 240 individuals or more. So we have a ways to go with Florida panther populations, but there have been huge strides in the last 10, 20 years. And now one of the biggest threats is the ability to have that habitat to allow them to expand. And this is where the importance of wildlife corridors will come in order to connect conservation lands to allow their population to spread out. So your first bonus species for federally endangered listing of a mammal is the Anastasia Island beach mouse. So this is also an endemic species, just like the Florida scrub jay, meaning you can only find it in the state of Florida. And not only can you only find it in the state of Florida, you can only find it here in St. Johns County. So that's really cool. It was federally listed in 1989, and in 1992 to 1993, they reintroduced the Anastasia Island beach mouse, which at the time was only found on Anastasia Island, but we know historically would have been up in our northern ranges of our beaches around the GTM Research Reserve area. So they took several individuals from our Anastasia Island population, reintroduced them into the GTM Research Reserve beach dunes. To my knowledge, that population never really established, and we don't believe that there is a healthy population left up at GTM or in the Volano area. I don't believe that there have been documentation, at least recently, about those species existing there. So I think we're back to just having Anastasia beach mouse on Anastasia Island. But we do know that we have them throughout almost the entire island, so including a lot of county dune systems. And so that's been really encouraging. There's been a lot of research going on here locally with our local county officials, as well as state FWC officials, state park officials, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife officials to try to get a better idea of what the population numbers are and what the range is here. And like I said, the results of that seem to show that we have a okay population and that they do seem to be more or less throughout Anastasia Island. Their biggest threats are storm events. So any of you who were here for Matthew or Irma know that we lost a good chunk of our dunes, and that contributes to habitat loss for the Anastasia beach mouse, and predation. So things like feral cats can have a huge impact on a species like this. Feral cats kill an incredible amount of wildlife every year, and so they can really negatively affect a small mouse species such as this one. Another really interesting thing about this species, and one of the reasons we want to make sure that we conserve it, is the role that it plays after those storm events in regenerating our dunes and making sure that our dunes stay stable. So these little mice species like to eat sea oats. Sea oats are the building block of an essential dune system. So sea oats really help to hold all of that sand together so that when we do get storm events, it at least braces the impact. You lose less sand when you have sea oats holding that sand in place. And so these little mice remind me of Cinderella and Gus Gus. When Gus Gus goes out and he's trying to pick up as many corn kernels as he has, and he has them all stacked up under his chin, and he's running, and then all of a sudden they kind of explode. That's basically what I envision this mouse doing with sea oats. And so he basically tries to stack up and bring back as many sea oats as he can, and he loses some along the way, and he leaves some in his burrow. And so he helps to distribute that sea oat seed, which can help us have a healthier dune system. Another one that's kind of a local highlight and why I wanted to put it on here is the North Atlantic right whale. So their story is similar to some other stories like the American alligator, where they were basically almost hunted to the brink of extinction. And so in 1935, they were banned from being hunted because, as their name implies, they were the right whale. They were the right whale to hunt. That's where that name came from. And so in 1935, they were banned for being hunted. In 1970, they were federally listed as an endangered species. In 1972, they received additional protections through the Marine Mammal Protection Act. In 1994, the National Marine Fisheries Service designated Florida and Georgia waters as critical habitat for the North Atlantic right whale. And one of the reasons that they did this is a really large whale species that actually spends most of its time up in the northern United States and Canada. These animals like to eat really tiny copepods and plankton. They're filter feeders. They have that big baleen, and they basically just open their mouth, close their mouth, push all of that water out, and they eat all the little itty bitty tiny stuff that's in the water. And so they spend a lot of time up in these colder waters. Well, when females are ready to have their babies, they make a long journey from these cold, almost Arctic waters down to the Georgia-Florida border and area, and they have their babies here because their babies do not have enough fat to be able to handle those colder water temperatures, especially in the wintertime. So while they're here, the calf is gaining about 100 pounds a day. Mom's milk is super rich in fat. Meanwhile, mom is getting skinnier and skinnier and skinnier because these large copepod groupings and plankton groupings don't really exist in our water here. Their primary food source doesn't exist here. So mom doesn't eat while she's here. She's getting skinnier feeding her calf. And at some point, there's a balance of mom's too skinny and needs food, and so she needs to go north. And calf is hopefully fat enough that she can handle, or he can handle, the colder conditions of the northern waters. And so they make their journey back north. One of their biggest threats is boat strikes. They are basically a log in the water, if you don't know what you're looking for, and they have no pectoral fin on their back. So there's literally just a flat back, flat in the water. And they get struck by boats a lot, and not just boats, but large boats. So in 1999, the National Marine Fisheries Service and Coast Guard implemented a mandatory ship reporting system. So there are specific areas where if large ships enter those areas, they have to report into this system. And this system works to be able to allow those large boats to be notified when a North Atlantic right whale is spotted in their vicinity so they can change course or stop. Really important, up in their Canada waters, they actually were able to put regulations in place to change shipping lanes entirely and where the boats went and were allowed to go in order to minimize basically whale and boat interactions. You also have entanglement problems, and so this happens a lot with the crabbing industry. So there was a North Atlantic right whale named Ruffian who 2 years ago, I believe it was, got tangled and basically carried a snow crab trap up from its colder northern regions down to right off of the Florida-Georgia border. He had about 450 feet of line and I think like 150-pound crab trap that he carried with him. Luckily, he was successfully disentangled, but there are a lot of whales who can't recover from that entanglement. Genetics, so there's only about 400 or so individuals. They're one of the most endangered large whale species in the entire world. And anytime you get a population that really has a small number of individuals, genetics can become a problem. And ocean noise. So all of their underwater sounds and noises can have a huge impact on the way that these whales communicate with each other. So moving on to our federally threatened species is our Florida manatee. They're so cute. In 1967, manatees were listed as federally endangered. And in 1972, they received additional protections under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. In 2017, they actually were able to be delisted from federally endangered to federally threatened, which is a huge milestone. That means their population numbers are headed in the right direction, that they are going up instead of going down. And based on all the evidence provided, the federal government deemed that this species basically could be taken from the at most risk. We're really worried about completely losing this species too. We still want to monitor it. We still want to watch it. It still could become threatened again, but we think that it can be bumped down a level. Some of the biggest things impacting manatees are boating. So most manatees on average have about 14 boating scars on their back. So they're hit a lot by boat propellers. Habitat loss, so we're losing a lot of the seagrass beds and areas that they usually feed from. And entanglement, just like most of our other marine species, they can easily become entangled in fishing line and fishing equipment, as well as other debris floating in the water that's man-made. For our Florida state threatened species, there's only 4 listed total. None of them are found here, so I'm just going to highlight them really quick. There's the big Cypress fox squirrel, the Sanibel Island rice rat, the Everglades mink, and the Sherman short-tailed shrew. All of these are found in like the southwest Florida area, so we don't have any of these up here in St. Johns County or in northeast Florida. So what you can do, some of this was a little doom and gloom, so I apologize. I just want to make sure I give you all the right information. But there's plenty that you can do to help either a specific species or help conserve species in general by conserving their habitat. So one of the most important things that you can do is contribute and support land conservation. So maybe you have property that you could manage differently or that you could buy and use to conserve. Support organizations that are doing land conservation, such as the North Florida Land Trust. That's a huge organization who's working on really big projects here in the Northeast Florida area to make sure that we preserve some of these critical habitats, as well as create connectivity along our conservation lands. Keep our beaches dark. We want to keep them dark for our species utilizing our beaches at night, like our sea turtles and our Anastasia beach mouse. Be a conscious boater. So not only is boating a potential bad interaction for wildlife we love, like dolphins, who are not at all listed and we have a lot of, but also things like our state threatened manatees. Be a responsible angler. So as you saw with a lot of these species, they have a high risk of entanglement, especially in our marine systems. And not only are those things living in the water at risk of becoming entangled, but birds also I've seen entangled in fishing line. So make sure that when you're out there fishing and you're enjoying our amazing waterways, that if you have to cut your line, you recover as much of that monofilament as possible. That if you need to discard monofilament, you put it in a monofilament recycling bin, and or any trash can will do. Just make sure it's not out in the environment. Be a responsible dog owner. So it's really important that you follow leash laws in conservation areas and on our beaches, because we don't want dogs flushing least terns off their nests, digging up sea turtle nests, attacking gopher tortoises. That's how Augie got hurt. And while I'm super grateful for Augie as a wildlife ambassador, I do wish he was out there in the wild living his best tortoise life. But unfortunately, he got attacked by a dog that was not on a leash, and he has injuries that don't allow him to live in the wild. So make sure you're a responsible dog owner. Keep your cats indoors. Outdoor cats and feral cats kill thousands or millions, I should say, millions of animals every year. In fact, there are species in other continents that have totally gone extinct as a direct result of feral cat populations. They are super cute, but they are deadly. And any of you who have cats know that your cats tend to bring you unwanted presents. Every single time an unwanted present is brought home, that's a life that could have been saved, because usually it's not like they're eating it. So it's just a dead animal that they hunted for fun. And then volunteer. There are so many efforts you can volunteer in, depending on if you want to work towards conserving a specific species or just in general. So you can become part of J-Watch. You can become part of the Shorebird Alliance and help do shorebird things. You can become part of the whale watching group that comes out in the wintertime and looks for the whales off the coast of Florida. You could become a sea turtle volunteer. There are so many things you can do. You can volunteer with wildlife agencies. You can volunteer with state and local park systems. So there are so many things you can do to volunteer. If there's one species that really tug at your heartstrings, kind of look into those volunteer opportunities when most of them are resuming, and some of them are about to start. I don't know if there's going to be a modified version of them given our current pandemic situation, but there's so much you can do. I hope that you enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you all so much for joining me. Know that there are so many more species that I didn't cover, but I just wanted to, for the sake of time, highlight some specific ones that either people knew a lot about or that were important here locally. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and you appreciated this presentation, and I'll catch up with you guys next time. Bye.